And Tony, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Now, Tony, China said an interesting thing there. I'm going to get your initial thoughts on this, but if you could also elaborate. He said that Ukraine should become a bridge between the East and the West and not an outpost that will promote this level of conflict. Your thoughts on this, Tony?
Well, I would love to see that, but I don't think it's going to happen. I would suggest to you that, we were commenting back last year when they had the surprise withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. A lot of people were celebrating that, but I and my colleagues on our radio show in Bristol were saying, well, hang on, whereabouts are these troops going to be deployed now? And now we know those troops are going into Eastern Europe. Many of those troops are going to be being trained anyway to be moved over to Eastern Europe. I think it's pretty clear that Ukraine is likely to turn into a very difficult customer for Putin. It's certainly not going to be an easy ride there, because we know that there's a lot of fascist cells, there's a lot of far-right cells, Nazi cells, and I don't say that lightly. These people really are big supporters of the Nazis in the Second World War. They see themselves as today's Nazis, and these are the sorts of people who the Russians will find popping up from behind a hedge over the next year or so and killing Russian soldiers, possibly just simply killing civilians to make things very difficult for the Russian occupation. And so I think we've got to keep a very, very close eye on them. And the Russians have not taken on an easy job there. They may withdraw, we shall see. But whatever it is, they're going to be having to deal with these far-right groups who will be doing everything they can to get dug in and seeing it as an occupied country wherever Russians are around, and using everything they can to get back at those Russians. When I think when you look at the economic sanctions, I think this is one of the most staggering things about the entire invasion and the reaction from the West, is that those sanctions are really not going to affect Russia. They're not going to affect China. They're going to affect the West far, far more. They're going to affect Europe and Europeans far more. And so those sanctions are really masochistic. They are basically a form of self-harming. And what amazes me, when we're talking about energy prices, food prices, things like this going up and up as a result of just simply refusing to admit that you've got one of the biggest producers of all sorts of manufactured goods, raw materials, etc. in the world that you're now starting to get cut off from. So there's a lot of people quite rightly saying, well, we don't really want to do that. We need to trade with Russia. We need to have Russia on our doorstep. And will the politicians get it sorted out? But no, the politicians will not get it sorted out, because I'm afraid they're behaving as if they own and control the big institutions of the world, even things like the sporting institutions, etc., and certainly the financial institutions. They are very, very powerful in there, and they simply have decided we are not going to deal with Putin. We're going to scapegoat him for all of our failings as leaders, and the people who are going to pick up the bill are mostly going to be European and American ordinary citizens, particularly the poorest, who are already in a situation when they can hardly afford to pay the rent and make ends meet. And also infantile, so infantile of the West to put personal sanctions onto Putin and Lavrov. This is the sort of thing you might expect would be cooked up at the gang round the side of the schoolhouse, of teenagers. This is the sort of petty, of course you're going to have to deal with Russia, even if it's, through other sorts of global crises like the climate change, all these other things, whether it's a pandemic, that kind of thing. Whatever happens, you're going to have to deal with the Russians, but they simply have put them in a box marked trouble in an infantile bullying fashion, and they're now saying, oh, well, we just don't want to deal with the Russians, mainly because they have completely failed as leaders to deal with their own countries and with their own economies, and they failed there. Other predatory interests have taken over, and so they've only got one person to point the finger at blame at, and that is Putin. One of the other key things about all of this is that it was entirely justified for Putin back in December to say, look, we need a new treaty arrangement in Eastern Europe. And he sent these draft treaties to NATO and to the United States, which they then ignored. And that's why they've got what they've had this week.
If you could hold on to that thought, because we don't have much time, I want to get one more question to each of you. Now, Jim, to Tony's point, it seems like Vladimir Putin has been one step ahead of the Bidens and the Macrons and the Johnsons, all throughout this ordeal. So really, what are the sanctions supposed to, really do to him? I'm pretty sure that him and his inner circle have really prepared themselves for any kind of fallout from this conflict. Not to mention that it really pales in comparison when you've heard him time and again say that he feels like Ukraine joining NATO is an existential threat to Russia. So where do sanctions really come into play here?
Well, Russia has made a decision about sanctions. What they've said is, you're going to sanction us no matter what we do. And we've already sanctioned us, and we came out all right with it. We came out maybe even better. They've already paid for that Nord Stream 2 with the increase in oil prices. Russia, and as you say, he has been saying for years, begging the Western media to listen to him. We consider these, as you say, existential issues of national interest. We are not going to allow ourselves to be militarily encircled by NATO missiles and NATO forces and turn Ukraine into an American spear against Russia. We're not going to let it happen. We have red lines. And once those red lines were crossed, and he tried for 8 years, the Donbass republics have been begging for him to recognize them, and he wouldn't do it. He said, no, I'm going to work with my partners. I'm going to work with Ukraine. So finally, at a certain point, time's up. We're going to act, and we're going to act in defense of what we consider our existential national security interests. And the Americans, have this idea that they can threaten everybody. Russians aren't scared now. They know they might be hurt, but they're willing to pay a price. And it's precisely the West that's going to pay the bigger price economically. And if there's a military conflict, they're going to pay a price in terms of damage to their countries, including the United States, that they are not prepared to pay. Because nobody in the United States or Western Europe, as you say, what are they doing this for? What does this benefit to them?
Thank you, Jim. And Tony, we have about a minute left. Biden's in action. How do you perceive it? Because Vladimir Zelensky feels like he's been completely abandoned by the West, especially by Washington, and we know that's the second in a few months. The Afghan government and the former Afghan government and the Afghan people feel exactly the same way.
Well, look, Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been used as a stick to goad the Russians by the West. And it's notable that we heard from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, yesterday, we will do everything we can to help you. Well, that it seems to be almost nothing. So the Ukrainians are wondering, what was that all about? But we have to, I think, understand just how important this is, because the complete refusal of the West to communicate with and to deal diplomatically on diplomatic levels with the Russians really is setting us on a course for war at some time. Sooner or later, I suppose the Russians have thought, well, if we are going to be heading for war, then we need to make sure that we've got a little bit more control over our back doorstep, and that's why they're sitting in Ukraine now. But the message has got to go out loud and clear to the world that unless this one is sorted out, there is going to be a conflagration between the West, between NATO and Russia at some time in the not too distant future, and it may be that it's sparked down in the Middle East, because of course we've got US interests, Israeli interests, Western interests as well as Russian interests down in Syria right now, and so wherever this conflict does erupt, it's going to erupt somewhere. So I think people should, basically make sure they got their tin hat ready. That's, I think, the message from the complete failure of the West to even bother to engage with Russia as a superpower that it is. And of course, that Russia is backed very, very definitely and fully by China too. So we're looking at possibly heading on the track now to World War III, but that isn't Putin's fault. That's the fault of the West. They need to talk to him and talk to him now.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both. Always a pleasure to check in with both of you. Stay safe. Jem Kavanaugh, they're joining us from New York, and Tony Gosling, they're joining us out of Bristol.